Okay, so now that we have gone over the very basics in graphing, I wanted to speed things up here a little bit. And usually when you start graphing in class, they ask you to graph a series of points, just like this up here. It'll say graph these. And what they do is they give them to you with a comma in between them, like right here. And how you read that is the first number, like say in this very first row here, the first number, the -4, is your x. The second number, the 6.5, is your y. It always goes x, comma, y. They'll never go y, comma, x. It always goes x, comma, y. So when they have you graph some points with a comma in between them, the first one is always the x, and the second one is always the y. So let's graph these series of points to draw a straight line. Okay, so first you have -4 is the x value. So remember the x value is the side to side, the purple line. So we want to go -4, and I've made these black lines to indicate what 1, 2, 3, and 4, and so on is. So each of these little black lines on the axes represent 1. So graph -4, comma, 6.5. So your -4 is your x-axis, that's the one that goes left and right, and your 6.5 is your y-axis, that's the one that goes up and down. So -4 is going to go back to the left from the 0, and as you can see, the 0 is in the middle. The x-axis and the y-axis always share the same 0, always. So -4 on the x-axis would go 1, 2, 3, 4, but you don't put a dot there. You have the 6.5 to go on the y-axis. So that 6.5 is positive, so you're going to go up. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then the half would just be this one additional square, 6.5. So that would be -4, 6.5. Okay, so the next set of values is -2 and 5. So the -2 would be on your x-axis. So you would start where the 0 is and count backwards 2 on the purple line. And then the 5, the y value is 5. That's positive, so you're going to go up 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So here is your -2 and 5. Now the next value, the third value, or the third coordinates is what they call them. Coordinates. It looks like coordinates, but everybody just says it's coordinates. So your third set of coordinates are 0 and 3.5. So 0 on the x-axis is exactly that. It's going to be the 0 right where the x-axis and the y-axis meet. And then 3.5 is your y value, so you go up 3.5. So 1, 2, 3, and a half. Doing good? All right, so your next set of coordinates is 2 and 2. So these are both positive numbers, +2 and +2. So your x value, your +2 at the beginning there, is going to go forward to the right from the 0, 2 marks, and then you're going to go up 2 marks, which is right here. Your next set of values, set of coordinates, is 4 and 1/2. So 4 on the x-axis, that's 4 over to the right, and then up 1/2. So that's just up one little square. Your next set of coordinates is 6 and -1. So we're going to go over to the right 6. That's a positive 6 on the x-axis. So we're going to go to the right 6 marks, and then -1. So that's -1 on the y-axis. So the y-axis is up and down. So if you have a negative number, you would go down. So you would go down to the 1 below the 0. So that would be -1 on the y-axis. It's still positive on the x-axis because we're to the right, but it's -1 on the y-axis. Now your last set of coordinates is +8 and -2.5. So the +8, I made all these color coded for you. The +8's in purple to remind you that the +8 is on the x-axis. So that's 8 to the right. So that's all the way over to the right. And then -2.5 is your y-axis. So you're going to go down 2.5 marks, which is going to be right here. All right, so now we've plotted all of these points in this list of coordinates, and so now we can draw a line that connects all of these points. So if this was just going to start at the starting dot and end at the ending dot, we would just start at the dot and draw a line all through all of these dots. And that should yield you a straight line in this case. It doesn't have to yield you a straight line, because remember from our previous examples, sometimes the line is crazy. It's like a V, or there's all these different peaks, and it looks like a mountain or something. But in this case, with these coordinates that I gave you, this will give you a straight line. And this straight line happens to be going downhill, which will be important in a minute when we go to look at what's called the slope. But I'm not going to go into that yet. But just notice that this line is going downhill. It starts up high and it goes down low. Okay, so now let's do another one real quick. And if you noticed, in these coordinates, I have put parentheses around them, because this is how you're usually going to see it in a math class when they're asking you to graph coordinates. They usually put the coordinates in parentheses. So you usually have a parentheses x coordinate, comma, y coordinate, close parentheses. So that's how you're usually going to see it. You're going to see them in parentheses, and the x is always first, and then there's a comma, and then the y. So let's do this. Let's graph these, okay? Your first thing is -6.5 and -1.5. So let's start with the -6.5. And of course, that's your x-axis. That's your x value. So -6.5, we're going to go to the left of the 0, 6.5 marks. So that's going to be right about here. But you don't put a dot there. You have to still take into account the y-axis, which is -1.5. So since it's -1.5, you're going to go down, not up. You're going to go down the y-axis 1.5, which will be right here. So there is your first dot. Your next set of coordinates is -5 and -1. So -5 is on the x-axis, so we're going to go to the left 5 from the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we're going to go down 1 since it's a -1 on the y-axis. Now your next set of coordinates is -3.5 and -1.5. So -3.5 for your x values, you're going to go to the left 1, 2, 3 and a half marks, and then you're going to go down 1/2 for your y value. Great. Now your next set of coordinates is -2 and 0. So the -2 is your x value, so you're going to go to the left 2 marks, and then your y value is 0. So you're not going to go anywhere. You're not going to go up or down because it's just 0. So you're going to stay on that line and make a dot right there. You're going to stay on that x line and make a dot because you have a 0 value for your y-axis, which means you don't go anywhere. You just stay at 0. Now your next set of values is -1/2 and +1/2. So on your x-axis, you're going to go -1/2. So you're going to count 1/2 to the left of the 0, and then you're going to go +1/2 on the y-axis. So you're going to go up 1/2 on the y-axis. So now we're in the positive side of the y-axis, but we're still on the negative side of the x-axis. Your next set of coordinates is going to be 1 and 1. So 1 is your x value, so you're going to count, now it's positive, so you're going to count to the right 1 mark on your x line, your purple line, your x-axis. And then you're going to go up 1 mark for your y-axis. Great. Now your next set of coordinates is 2.5 and 1.5. So these are both positives now. We're all on the positives now. So on your x-axis, you're going to count over to the right 2.5, and then you're going to count up 1.5. Now your next set of coordinates is 4, 2. So 4 is your x value, so you're going to count to the right 4 notches, and then you're going to count up 2 notches. So that's going to be right there. And your next set of coordinates is 5.5 and 2.5. So you're going to count over to the right 5.5, and then you're going to count up 2.5, which would be right there. And then finally, your last set of coordinates is 7 and 3. So we're going to go 7 to the right. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to the right. And then we're going to go up 3. So 1, 2, 3. And there is your last dot for all of those coordinates. And now we can draw a line, a straight line, because I gave you coordinates, on purpose I gave you all these coordinates to make a straight line. We can draw a straight line through all of these dots. And now notice, unlike the last practice problem we did, this line is going uphill. It's starting down low and then it's getting high as you read it from left to right. And again, this is going to play an important part when you get to figuring out what the slope of the line is, which I'll talk about in a minute. So now we're going to talk about slopes. Slopes. And a slope, all a slope is how steep the line is. How steep the line is. So look at all these lines I have drawn in this graph. I have this top one. This goes up pretty steep all the way up from this point down here to this point up here. And then I have another line that starts at this point, and it's not as steep. It's still kind of steep, but it's not as steep. and it goes up to this point. I have this line. This is pretty steep too. This starts down here and goes up at a sharp incline up like this. And then I have these ones that are pointing down. So I have this one on the left, starts there, and it goes downhill, down to this point. And I have another downhill one that starts at this point, and this is really steep. This goes down like this and ends up at this point right here. So the steepness is what the slope is, and we can actually measure how steep the line is with our coordinates, with our points, with our dots that we've made. And it will tell us an exact measurement of how steep each line is. And we do that by figuring out where the beginning and ending points are. Or if there's points along the graph, you can use those too. You can use, if it's a straight line, you can use any of the points in the line. It doesn't matter. So let's start with this top blue one that goes up pretty steep. Let's figure out what this first coordinate is, this first dot is on the left. So x and y values, let's figure out what the x value is. Now the x value, this is to the left of the 0, so the x value is going to be negative. So we need to go down and see where this notch is, where the point lines up. That's the x value. So this is -1, -2, -3, -4. Let's put it in parentheses. So -4 for the x value. And now we need to find out what the y value is. So the y value is above the 0, so the y value is going to be positive. So we're just going to count up how far this dot is on the y-axis. So 1, 2, 3. So this goes 3 notches up on the y value. So the coordinates for this point is -4, 3. Now let's find out the end dot, the dot up here at the top. So this dot is in the positive. Let's put it in parentheses. This dot goes over 1 notch and a half a notch. So this is going to be a positive 1.5 for your x value. And then you put a comma, and then we see how high it is, how far it went up the y-axis. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this dot is 7 notches up on the y-axis. So that's a positive 7. So our coordinates are for this line is -4, 3, close parentheses, and then you do another set of parentheses, and you go 1.5, 7. And that is how you write the coordinates for that line. Now, what does this have to do with finding the slope and how steep it is? All the slope is how far it went up and then how much it went over. And that's what the slope is. So we start at the beginning point and we find out how far it went up to get to the ending point and how far it went over to get to the ending point. So if we started with a -4 and a 3 on the y-axis. So this is -4, 3. This started at 3 on the y-axis, and it went up to a 7. So here's the 7 on the y-axis. So in total, if you subtract the 7 minus the 3 where it started from, you're going to get 4. And then we got to find out how far it went over. And it started at -4 and it ended up at +1.5. So if you put those together, that's going to give you 5.5. So it went up 4, and then you put a fraction bar, and it went over 5.5 to the right. So this would be your slope, and this is a measurement of how steep that line is. Now to demonstrate this, because I know that might be a little bit confusing at first, to demonstrate this, let's go to that actual line on the graph, okay? So it starts down here at -4, 3. So we're going to count how far it goes up to get to the end point. So the end point is up here. So if you kind of look across the line where it ended up at, and you count up how far it went up. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. It went up 4 notches to get to the end point. So that's going to be your 4. And you write that on top of a fraction bar. That's just how we write slopes. And then you're going to count how far it went over to get to the end point. So it went over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5. So it went over 5.5 marks to get to the end point. So that's 5.5, and you put that on the bottom. So let's do some more of these so they're not so confusing. Now here's an example, and I give you a much shorter line, so it might seem a little bit simpler this way. So here's a line, and we need to find the slope. And you can see the beginning point and the ending point. So let's look at the beginning point, and let's figure out what the coordinates are for that beginning point. Now first, parentheses, and then we need to find out what the x value is of that point. So that point is 1 notch. Here's the notch, and that's 1. So that point is 1 notch over to the right on the x-axis. So that's +1, and then you put a comma. And then what is it on the y-axis? Well, we count up 1, 2 notches, so that's +2. So the coordinates for that first point is 1, 2. Now let's look at the end point. Here's the end point. So what are the coordinates for that end point? So we put them in parentheses. When we do the x first, the x value is all the way over 1 notch, 2 notches, 3 notches. So the x value is 3. And you put a comma. And then we count up how many notches up the y-axis this point is from the 0. So here's the 0. and we count up 1 notch, 2 notches, 3 notches. Because see the 3, it's on the 3 line. It's on the 3 line of the y-axis. So that is also a positive 3. So the coordinates for this line is 1, 2, and 3, 3. Now, in order to find the slope, we need to start at the first point, and we need to find out how much it went up the y-axis to get to the second point. So the second point is at this level, and the first point is at this level on the y-axis. So it went up 1. It went up 1 notch. So put a 1 there. And then we're going to count over to the right how far it went over on the x-axis to get to the second point, to get to the end point. So it went over 1 notch, 2 notches. So that went over 2 notches. So the way we write this is whatever it went up 1 point, 1 notch, and we put a fraction bar, and it went over 2 notches. So the slope is 1/2. So all you're doing is you're counting how many notches from the first point to the last point it went up, and then how many notches it went over from the beginning point to the end point. And when you're writing these coordinates, remember we always write the x first, comma, and then the y. X and then the y. But on the slope, you're going to put the y, how much it went up on the y-axis, over how much it went over on the x-axis. So the difference between the last y and the last y is 3. The difference between that last y and the first y is 2. You just subtract those. And then for the x, for the bottom of the slope, you look at the last x, the end point x, which is 3, and you take away the first x, which is 1. So that's 3 minus 1, and that gives you 2. And then you just put a fraction bar right there. So you have 1 over 2. So the slope is 1/2. Now the algebraic way to write this is we had the first set of coordinates was 1, 2. That was the first set of coordinates. And the second set of coordinates was 3, 3. That was the end point. That was the second set of coordinates. So if you want to get fancy, you can write the first set of coordinates x with a little 1, a subscript 1 next to it, and then a comma, and then a y with a subscript 1, and put that in parentheses, because these are the first coordinates. This is the first point, the beginning point. And then the second point, the 3, 3, you can write that as an x with a 2 subscript after it, comma, y with a 2 subscript after it, because these are the second points of the line. This is the end point. So the 1, 2 is the first set of coordinates. So you can write that 1 with a little 1 after it, comma, 2 with a little 1 after it, to show that those are the coordinates for the first point in the line. And then the second point in the line, the 3, 3, you can write 3 with a little 2 after it, comma, 3 with a little 2 after it, because that's the second point in the line. That's the second point in the line. The algebraic equation for finding the slope is going to be, there's going to be a fraction bar because the slope is a fraction. And you're going to have the second y minus the first y over the second x minus the first x. So in our case, that would be, see, the second y is going to be the 3. So that's going to be 3 minus the first y, and the first y was a 2. And then you go over, and then the second x, the end point coordinate, the second x was a 3 minus the first x. The first x was a 1. So 3 minus 2 equals 1, and 3 minus 1 equals 2. And that's going to be your fraction telling you the slope of the line, how steep the line is. Now here's another one. Here's another line. We're going to do this, now that I've explained it a little bit, we're going to do this a little bit more quickly and easier. Now that I've explained the concept of it, I'll explain to you how you can really do it and make it easy on yourself. So we're going to go to the second point first. Okay, we're going to go to the end point. And the end point is the one to the right, because just like you read from left to right, the end point is going to be the one on the right. It doesn't matter if it's higher or lower, it's just going to be the one on the right. So here's going to be your end point. Okay, so let's find out the coordinates for this end point. The coordinates for this end point is, if you look down, for the x-axis, it went over 1, 2, 3, 4. So the x is going to be 4, and then comma. And if you look at how high it is, it went up the y-axis 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is going to be 4 as well. So that's your end point. So remember what I was telling you about. Your end point is x with a little 2 after it, because that's your second point, y with a little 2 after it, because that's your second point. So in this case, it's going to be 4 with a 2 and 4 with a little 2, because that's your second point, your end point. Now let's look and see what the first point is, your beginning point, the one on the left. So the beginning point, first we're going to find out what the x is, and if you look down, that's on the 3. So your x is 3, and then if you look over, that's 2 notches up, so your y is going to be 2, 3, 2. So for your beginning point, that's going to be x with a little 1 and y with a little 1 after it for your first point. So in our case, that's going to be a 3 with a little 1 and a 2 with a little 1. Okay? Now, as I said, the algebraic formula that you're going to be seeing when you take tests is, for the slope, is y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So we are going to plug in these values and do the subtraction and get a fraction. So the y2, remember, it's going to be this one up here that we found, which is this 4. So the y2 is going to be 4 minus the y1, which is going to be this value, which in our case for this line is going to be a 2. So that's going to be 4 minus 2. And then all over x2, which is going to be, which is going to be this 4 right up here. That's your x2. That's your x point, your x value on the second point, the end point. That's a 4. And then we're going to have minus x1. So we're going to look over here. Here's your x1, which in our case is 3. So this is going to be 4 minus 3. So all you have to do is do the subtraction. So 4 minus 2 is 2 over 4 minus 3 is 1. So your slope is going to be 2 over 1. So let's do one more like this, and then I'm going to change it up and we'll look at it in a different way, figuring out the slope, so to make sure that it's not confusing. But let's do one more like this, because this is how you might see it on a test. So here's your line, and your first point is this one over here, because you read from left to right. So your first point is going to be the one on the left. So that's point 1. So these coordinates, point 1 coordinates, are going to be x1, comma, y1 in parentheses. And then your point 2 is going to be right here. That's going to be your point 2. So point 2 is going to be x2, comma, y2. And that's how they refer to it in math classes, because this is your second point. So you're going to have the little 2's after them. And your first point is going to have the little 1's after them. So let's find out what these actual values are. So your first point, the x goes over from the 0, 1 notch, 2 notches, 3 notches. So that's your x value is at 3 notches over on the x-axis. So up here on the right, we're going to write, for your first point, you're going to write 3, and we're going to put a little 1 after it. So we can say that's our first x value, and then a comma. And then our y value for this first point is going to be how far up it is on the y-axis. So that's over here. So that has only gone up 1 notch on the y-axis. So your y value is going to be 1. And we're going to write a little 1 after it to remind us that that's our first point, and close parentheses. Now let's do our second point in the green. Now what's the x value for our second point? Well, we have to count over how many notches it went over to the right from the 0. So it went over 1 notch, 2 notches, 3 notches, 4 notches, 5 notches. So for our second value, our x value is 5. And we're going to put a little 2 after that 5 to remind us that's the x value for the second point, and a comma. And then what's the y value for that second dot? Well, we have to count up how much it went up, how much it goes up on the y-axis. So starting from down here, it went up 1 notch, 2 notches, 3 notches, 4 notches. So 4 is going to be our y value for that second point. And we're going to put a little 2 next to it to remind us that's our second point for the y value. So now we have our values of the first point and the second and the last point, the end point of this line. So now what's the equation that you do to find the slope? It's y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So we're doing the values of the second points minus the values of the first points. So that's going to be, in our case, the y2. Let's start with the y2. The y2 in our case is going to be this 4. So we're going to write 4 and then minus, and then the y1. So the y1 in this case is going to be 1. So 4 minus 1. And then we put a fraction bar, and then we set up the x2 minus x1. So the x2 in our case is going to be the 5, because that corresponds to our second point. The x value of this second point is 5. So we're going to write a 5 down here and a minus. And then we're going to write down what the x1 value is from our first point. And the x1 value is 3. So then we just do the subtraction. 4 minus 1 is 3 over 5 minus 3 is 2. So our slope is 3 over 2.